From New York, this is Democracy Now!
It ain't over till every vote is counted. Every ballot is counted.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning.
The presidential race remains too close to call as ballots continue to be counted in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, and other states. President Trump prematurely declared victory overnight and called for the halt to the counting of absentee ballots. But the counting continues. Meanwhile, it remains unclear who'll control the Senate after Republicans had a stronger night than projected, but several races remain too close to call, and at least one is going to a runoff. We'll speak with Ben Jealous, head of People for the American Way, former Bernie Sanders spokesperson Brianna Joy Gray, the nation's John Nichols in Wisconsin, and immigrants' rights activist Erica Andiola in Arizona. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The presidential race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden remains too close to call, with ballots still being counted in the undecided races of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and North Carolina. Early this morning, Biden spoke in Wilmington, Delaware, and called for patience as votes are being counted.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election. We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it's going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted. Every ballot is counted.
Shortly before 1 a.m., Trump took to Twitter to accuse Democrats of trying to steal the election without offering any proof at all. Then, just after 2:20 a.m. Eastern, Trump addressed the nation from the White House.
This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. Okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment, and we will win this. And as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it. So I just want
Despite the president's charge, no evidence of fraud has emerged in any state. Historically, no state reports final election results on election night. Election authorities in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan have repeatedly warned prior to Election Day that it could take days to count the record number of early votes. Across the country, over 101 million people cast early votes, either in person or by mail, shattering every previous record. At the time of this broadcast, Biden is leading in Wisconsin by just over 20,000 votes, with an estimated 97% of votes reported. Biden also maintains a slim lead of about 8,000 votes in Nevada. Nevada's election division announced no more results will be given until 11 a.m. Eastern on Thursday. Trump's leading in Pennsylvania by more than 600,000 votes, but the race remains too close to call. Election officials in Philadelphia are expected to report results from early voting at 9 a.m. In Michigan, Trump is leading narrowly by about 26,000 votes, but the heavily Democratic city of Detroit is expected to take until Wednesday night to complete its count of absentee ballots, and there are many other counties that have many ballots to be counted in Michigan. Trump is also leading in Georgia and North Carolina. The Associated Press and Fox have projected Joe Biden to be the winner in Arizona, but other networks say the race is still too close to call. In the popular vote, Biden has a commanding lead of over 2.2 million votes, and the figure is expected to keep growing as more ballots are counted. It's possible Biden could become the third Democrat in the past 20 years to win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College. Control of the Senate is still up for grabs, as several key races remain too close to call. But it looks increasingly likely that the Democrats will fall short of their goal of taking control of the Senate. Democrats picked up 2 seats on Tuesday night, one in Colorado, where former Governor John Hickenlooper defeated Republican Senator Cory Gardner, and one in Arizona, where Democrat Mark Kelly has unseated Republican Senator Martha McSally. In Alabama, Trump-backed Republican Tommy Tuberville, the former head coach of the Auburn football team, has defeated incumbent Democratic Senator Doug Jones. Georgia voters cast ballots in 2 Senate races. Democrat Reverend Raphael Warnock will head to a runoff special election in January against Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler. In Georgia's other Senate race, incumbent Republican David Perdue is leading Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff. Several Senate races remain too close to call. In Maine, Republican Senator Susan Collins is leading in her bid for re-election. It's Maine's first election since the state instituted ranked choice voting. In North Carolina, Republican Tom Tillis is leading over Democratic challenger Cal Cunningham. Republicans won many of the most high-profile races. In Kentucky, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell easily defeated Democratic challenger Amy McGrath. In Iowa, Republican Senator Joni Ernst has survived a strong challenge by Teresa Greenfield. Mississippi's Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith has defeated Democrat Mike Espy, who served as the first African-American U.S. Agriculture Secretary under Bill Clinton. And in South Carolina, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham defeated Democrat Jamie Harrison in the most expensive Senate race in U.S. history. Graham spoke after winning re-election.
All the pollsters out there, you have no idea what you're doing. And to all the liberals in California and New York, you wasted a lot of money. This is the worst return on investment in the history of American politics.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is poised to retain her Speaker's gavel, with Democrats set to hold a majority of the House's 435 seats. But election night returns suggest House Democrats may have actually lost ground to Republicans, who flipped Democratic-held districts in Florida, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. In a closely watched race in Virginia's 5th District, African-American physician Cameron Webb has lost to Republican Bob Good, a born-again Christian seeking to overturn gun control laws and outlaw all forms of abortion. Meanwhile, all 4 progressive freshman congresswomen of color, known as the Squad, have been reelected 2 years after taking Capitol Hill by storm. They include the first 2 Muslim women elected to Congress, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Also holding their seats, Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. In New York's 16th congressional district, Jamal Bowman has defeated Republican challenger Patrick McManus. Bowman's a former Bronx middle school principal who recently joined protests demanding an end to racism and police brutality. In June's Democratic primary, Bowman defeated Congressmember Eliot Engel, the Foreign Affairs Committee chair, who served in Congress for more than 30 years. Congressmember-elect Bowman spoke to Democracy Now! On election night.
I'm going to Washington to fight for housing as a human right, healthcare as a human right, fully funding our public schools, a federal jobs guarantee, raising the federal minimum wage, a Green New Deal, and humane criminal justice and immigration reform.
Also here in New York, Democrats Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres are set to become the first 2 openly gay black men elected to Congress, replacing lawmakers who are retiring after decades in Washington. Mondaire Jones spoke with Democracy Now! Election night.
I'm so thrilled to be running on a platform of Medicare for All, for example. the only healthcare proposal that would literally ensure everyone in the richest nation of the world has healthcare in the midst of a global pandemic, where people have been losing their health insurance as they have lost their jobs.
In Missouri's 1st congressional district, which includes St. Louis and Ferguson, Democrat Cori Bush has defeated Republican Anthony Rogers. Cori Bush won a stunning primary upset in August over 10-term incumbent Congressmember William Lacey Clay, whose family has represented the St. Louis area congressional district for more than half a century. Cori Bush is a single mother and a nurse. She was formerly homeless and was a leader in the 2014 Ferguson uprising over the police killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown. In Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene has won the 14th congressional district. Her opponent, Democrat Kevin Van Osdol, withdrew from the race in September for personal reasons. Greene ran on a pro-gun, anti-immigrant, anti-choice platform and has embraced the QAnon conspiracy theory, which claims President Trump is secretly at war with a deep state cabal of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex trafficking operation. In Puerto Rico's gubernatorial race, Pedro Pierluisi has a thin lead over Carlos Delgado. The candidates are separated by less than 10,000 votes. Pierluisi is a member of the New Progressive Party, which supports statehood for Puerto Rico. Delgado of the Popular Party wants to keep Puerto Rico's status as a U.S. colony. Pierluisi briefly served as governor in 2019 after Governor Ricardo Rosselló was forced to resign amidst mass protests. Puerto Ricans also took to the polls to decide on a referendum that would determine if the island could be granted statehood. The New York Times reports support for the referendum led with about 52% of the votes. However, Congress would have to approve of any changes to Puerto Rico's political status. In other election news, the U.S. Postal Service Tuesday refused to comply with a federal court order to sweep mail processing centers and deliver mail-in ballots that may have been unaccounted for. The order came after USPS announced over 300,000 mail-in ballots nationwide could not be traced for delivery. The U.S. Postal Service had until 3:30 p.m. Eastern to conduct the checks and make sure all ballots could be delivered before polls closed. Instead, USPS said it would maintain its own inspection schedule. The order affected facilities in 12 postal districts across 15 states, including battleground states like Arizona and Pennsylvania, where mail-in ballots must be delivered by the end of Election Day in order to be counted. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy is a Trump megadonor who has come under fire for recent changes at the Postal Service that have caused widespread delays and sparked major concerns over mail-in ballots. In related news, the New York Times reports mail-in ballots cast by Black and Latinx voters are being rejected at higher rates than white voters, including in the battleground states of Georgia and Florida. Meanwhile, a network of activists calling itself the Protect the Results Coalition plans to mobilize in over 500 locations across the U.S. today against President Trump's false declaration of victory. The United States confirmed more than 92,000 new coronavirus infections on Election Day, one of the highest one-day tolls for any country during the pandemic. Over 1,100 COVID-19 deaths were reported across the U.S. on Election Day as hospitalizations reached their highest level since mid-August. Former Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb warns the U.S. should expect to see over 1,000 daily deaths from COVID-19 for a sustained period of time. Hurricane Eta has brought catastrophic damage to the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua and Honduras, with heavy rain and winds triggering inland flooding and landslides. The hurricane is the 28th named storm of 2020's record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season and one of the strongest storms to hit Central America since Hurricane Mitch killed thousands of people 2 decades ago. In California, ride-hailing app makers led by Uber and Lyft have succeeded in their $200 million campaign to prevent gig economy workers from becoming employees eligible for benefits and job protections. Proposition 22's passage by California voters is a stinging defeat for organized labor. The ballot measures were opposed by Human Rights Watch, which produced this video urging a no vote.
Gig companies classify workers as independent contractors instead of employees. That allows them to circumvent federal and state labor protections, since independent contractors don't get minimum wage protections, guaranteed sick pay, or the ability to join a union. The gig companies also don't pay into Social Security or Medicare on behalf of the workers they classify as independent contractors.
Oklahoma voters have rejected a ballot measure which would have ended the use of repeat sentence penalties for nonviolent crimes. The measure would have freed thousands of prisoners, a disproportionate number of them people of color. In Nebraska, voters have overwhelmingly approved a ballot measure capping payday loans at a 36% annual interest rate. Florida voters have approved a ballot measure to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2026. Mississippi voters have approved a new state flag with a magnolia flower replacing the Confederate battle flag emblem that had flown over the Mississippi state capitol since 1894. In Arizona and New Jersey, voters have approved ballot measures legalizing the possession and use of recreational marijuana for adults aged 21 and up. And in Oregon, Measure 110 has passed, making Oregon the first state to decriminalize low-level drug possession while legalizing the recreational use of psychedelic mushrooms. Oregon will use the savings from reduced prison time to fund crime prevention and addiction treatment programs. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, the presidential race remains too close to call as ballots continue to be counted. We'll speak to Ben Jealous, head of People for the American Way, former Bernie Sanders spokesperson Brianna Joy Gray. We'll go to Wisconsin to speak with the nation's John Nichols, and we'll go to Arizona to speak with immigrant rights activist Erica Andiola. Stay with us.
On the 10th floor down the back stairs into no man's land. Lights are flashing, cars are crashing, getting frequent now. I've got the spirit, lose the feeling, let it out somehow.
Disorder by Joy Division. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York. My co-host Juan Gonzalez at his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The presidential race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden remains too close to call, with millions of ballots still to be counted in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and other states. Earlier this morning, at around 2:20 a.m. Eastern, President Trump prematurely and falsely claimed victory.
This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment, and we will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it. So I just want to thank...
Despite the president's charge, no evidence of fraud has emerged in any state. Earlier in the evening, about 2 hours before, Joe Biden said all votes should be counted.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election.
Biden.
We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it's going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted. Every ballot is counted.
Across the country, over 101 million people cast early votes, either in person or by mail, shattering all previous records. Many of those votes have not yet been counted in some states. At the time of this broadcast, Biden is leading by small margins in Wisconsin and Nevada. In Michigan, Trump is leading by just 13,000 votes. Trump has a large lead in Pennsylvania, but many votes from Philadelphia have not yet been counted, as well as surrounding areas throughout the state. Trump is also leading in Georgia and North Carolina, but both states remain too close to call. We begin our show with Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way, former president of the NAACP. His op-ed was published in USA Today. It's headlined, "Election Chaos. Keep Calm, Keep Counting, and Get to Work." And we're joined by Brianna Joy Gray, former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders 2020. She's the co-host of the Bad Faith podcast and contributing editor to Current Affairs. She tweeted through the night, so we were fortunate to be able to talk to her today because she tweeted right through this morning. Ben Jealous, we're beginning with you. Election chaos, keep calm, keep counting, and get to work. Respond to what President Trump says. He declared victory and called the elections a fraud.
Trump is a fraud. Let's be clear here. We have reason to be very, very hopeful. Joe has won every single state that was won in 2016 by Ms. Clinton. He's also won Nebraska. He's won Arizona, and there's huge buckets of votes to be counted in urban areas: Pittsburgh, Philly, Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta. It's not just that there's votes that are left to be counted in these states. A lot of the little areas have come in, but the big urban areas, there's huge buckets of votes to be counted. So, Trump did what we expected him to do, which was to try to perpetrate this fraud on the people of our country that he had won when he has not. And I would say to my fellow Dems and folks who voted against Trump, folks who voted for Biden, just keep calm. We've got this. We've always known that we would have to wait for every vote to be counted. We're just going to have to keep calm and count every vote.
Well, let's talk about one of the first states that was called last night, and that was Florida. Now, we know that many thousands, if not over 1 million votes, this is before the election, well before. When you talk about voter suppression, who got to vote and who didn't initially, if you can talk about what you see happened in Florida, and particularly talk about the Latinx vote. It definitely didn't come out for Biden and Harris in the way the Democrats had predicted.
When you dig into what's going on with the Latinx vote in Florida, you've got to acknowledge a couple of things. One is that Donald Trump heavily outspent Joe Biden in advertising on Spanish language media targeting Latinx swing voters all across the country. Last time I checked, it was 10-1. People for one of the things that we tried to do was to make up for that gap. And we found ourselves scrambling, trying to get dollars for instance, even statewide radio in Florida. So there was just a failure over the summer to really court Latinx voters, especially those who speak Spanish as their main language. The second problem was, frankly, one of relationship. If you talk to folks in the Venezuelan community, which is critical to winning South Florida, where Joe did not perform as well as he did throughout the state, it's kind of insane because Trump and Pence, from a policy perspective, have great antipathy for what that community wants. And yet the leaders will say, but we know them. You know, Pence made dozens of trips down here. Democrats just made a few at that point. And so, you've got to kind of give it to Trump that from a marketing perspective, they've done a very good job of marketing themselves to Latinx voters in Southern Florida, despite the fact that they have Latinx children in cages on the border. And quite frankly, their policy interests are not in line, even with folks like in the Venezuelan community, whose leaders were very supportive of them because they felt like they had a relationship.
I wanted to bring Brianna Joy Gray into this conversation, again, former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders. Talk about your response as you saw the way things were unfolding, what you predicted, what you're seeing now. In a moment, we're going to be speaking with Erica Andiola in Arizona. It may well be this Republican state was flipped. Fascinatingly, it was Fox that first called it to the ire of President Trump. CNN has yet to call it. But you have Arizona that looks like it has been won by Biden, but you have the very close races in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Michigan, in Florida, in Pennsylvania. I mean, could you imagine what would happen if there wasn't a pandemic?
Yeah, the tragedy of this election, regardless of what the outcome ends up being, is that it was ever this close at all. For months, for years, Democrats have accurately described Trump as a pox on the country, as someone who has undermined every norm, who has caused a great deal of hardship on specifically historically marginalized communities, and someone who has done little at all to stem off the worst effects of this global health pandemic from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. And yet here we are. And I think when you start to dig a little deeper, you see what's going on. This was an election in which the Democratic Party was very clear to put neoliberalism on the ballot. Donald Trump, Joe Biden was a candidate who bragged to his donors that nothing would fundamentally change. He ran clearly feeling with the plan to marginalize the left and to be very clear about the fact that he didn't feel like he needed to reach out and do that kind of outreach. And specifically, he failed in the ways that Bernie Sanders really excelled when it came to Latino voters. And what you saw in Florida is not just that they were outspent, but that Donald Trump was up on the airwaves with Spanish language ads a full month before Joe Biden got into the state. Choices were made about when to invest and to what degree. And those choices ignored, perhaps fatally ignored, the extent to which the Latino vote is not guaranteed and it has to absolutely be earned by building a relationship of trust over time. And when you look at Nevada, one of the reasons why Joe Biden has done much better in terms of the Latino vote there is because he got there earlier and spent more money in the state. And also, there's some reporting out of The Intercept that he was helped there by the fact that marijuana legalization was on the ballot, and that might have turned out more voters. So we're seeing some arguable correlation between pushing progressive policies and, of course, investing in communities in states going toward Democrats. And I think that we need to really think critically about how successful this nothing will fundamentally change message ultimately will be for the Democratic Party in the long run.
Ben Jealous, your response.
Well, I think all of that was spot on. Our party has to, frankly, learn from the Trump campaign as far as we have to market to every single voter. The way that they went after, young black men, just trying to pull off 3-4%. We should have gone after with the intention of getting 95%. The way that they went after the Latinx community trying to get to 40%, we should have gone after trying to get to 80%. We've got to stop taking this kind of machine boss approach where you're just asking, are you winning a particular community? And you've got to start seeing the people of this country as individuals, and you have to fight for every single one of their votes. And so I do believe that we're going to win. It should not be this close. Right now, we just got to keep calm, count every vote, push hard, and we have to push against the disinformation that is coming straight out of the White House in the mouth of the President of the United States, who took to the television at 2 a.m. to lie to the American people. And, Brianna, your response to what Trump said, I mean, secretaries of state, both Republican and Democrat, have repeatedly warned, they're the ones in charge of state elections, have repeatedly warned that they have to be able to have time to vote, to count that vote. And yet President Trump, while he wants every vote counted in Arizona, right, because right now Biden is ahead. Fox called it. CNN didn't call it. Mark Kelly, the Democrat, has beaten the sitting senator, Martha McSally, in a special election. She had that's in Arizona. He wants every vote counted there. But in Pennsylvania, where he has repeatedly gone after absentee ballots, calling them fraudulent, he wants the voting stopped. And interestingly, he said, and this is going to go to the Supreme Court. Like, forget the other courts that lead up to the Supreme Court. He's taking this, his suggestion was, to his court.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was the game plan that a lot of very sensible folks warned about, right? Bernie Sanders predicted this almost word for word on the late night show earlier this week, right? And that's part of why it's so frustrating that this race was close to begin with, because as I also predicted on Bad Faith Podcast, I said, if this is a landslide, Biden clearly wins and can declare victory and can claim victory, on Tuesday or Wednesday morning, then we're in good shape. But if there's any ambiguity here, we're at real risk that Donald Trump will try to railroad through a result of his liking. Because the reality is, and I think that Trump and the Republicans recognize, that they are a lot better at these kind of strategic fights. It's not that they're fair. It's not that they're legal. But Republicans are willing to scrape and fight for every advantage in a way that, as we just saw in the Amy Coney Barrett debacle, Democrats simply are not. And in a situation like this, where there is an ability to create ambiguity, even if there isn't, in fact, ambiguity, it's hard for me to imagine the steps that Democrats will take to prevent this from, yes, going to a favorable court for Donald Trump, and for this being a redux of the year 2000 and the 2000 election, after which I would like to point out electoral forms were not put into place.
So let's talk, Ben Jealous, about the position of Biden. As you said, this race is way too early to call. And I want to talk about the kind of organizing that you have been doing. If President Trump refuses to accept the counting of the ballots, it's been amazing over the last few days to see that wall go up around the White House. First it was wire. And then it was a wall, preparing, not clear exactly for what. And I should say yesterday he had hundreds of people in the White House starting at 7 o'clock in the evening. Again, the issue of the White House becoming a hotspot, a super spreading event in itself. And they stayed until well after 2 in the morning when he gave his speech to cheers as he talked about his victory and the fraudulent election. But I wanted to go to the issues of Joe Biden. You ran for governor of Maryland, and the kinds of issues that you represented and the kind of issues that Biden really stayed away from. That's the issue of Medicare for all. Joe Biden said he would veto it if it came to his desk if he was president. I mean, if it came to his desk, that would mean that Republicans and Democrats would have had to have endorsed it. The issue of a Green New Deal, clear that he was not endorsing a Green New Deal. And also that whole issue of fracking that he once said he was against and then said he was against and then said he was for. But do you think, rather than adopting a progressive position that would mobilize voters, it's not that progressives don't have somewhere else to go, especially when it comes to Trump. They can just decide not to vote.
Joe Biden played his playbook. It looks like it's going to win the presidency for him. With that said, the playbook of the party has to shift. The party has to run towards the people of the country, has to run towards its base. Kamala, quite frankly, has much more of that in her. I've known her for years. And that has to be the future of the party, is to actually fight for every single vote, to be clear to working class men of all colors that we have a vision for your economic prosperity. Because right now you're seeing Trump get more men of every color than he should. And it's a real appeal to patriarchy. And you've got to replace that, frankly, with a strategy for how you're actually going to shore up people economically. Because when they're falling for the floor, they'll grasp for anything, including outmoded ways of being. We have to really fight for every Latinx vote. We've got to fight for every Black vote. We got to fight for every young person's vote. And that means that we have to be a party that is unabashed about pushing for a vision that actually saves the planet, provides health care for everybody, and again, provides a pathway to economic success for everyone in the country. We're supposed to be the party of FDR. Now, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that Joe Biden can be that president, even if he wasn't that candidate. What that's going to require is for us as a movement to push him to his better angels. And so we're going to count every vote. We're going to be optimistic in this moment. Joe Biden will win, and then we will push him as hard, as FDR said himself. I agree with what you say, go make me do it. We're going to have to go make Joe do a bunch of things that our children, born and yet unborn, need us to do in order to secure a better future for this country and our planet.
I want to bring in another guest, and I also want to say Juan Gonzalez was co-hosting today, but because we are living in these pandemic times, we are socially distanced, and he's having a problem with his computer.
Okay.
But I wanted to bring in John Nichols, who is currently in Madison, Wisconsin. The presidential race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden remains too close to call, as we've said throughout this show, where we are broadcasting this in the morning of the day after the election. Ballots still being counted in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Nevada, and other states. Biden is leading in Wisconsin by just over 20,000 votes as we broadcast, with an estimated 97% of votes reported. In Michigan, Trump's leading narrowly by 24,000 votes, but the heavily Democratic city of Detroit is expected to take until, well, sometime tonight, possibly, to complete its count of absentee ballots. And then you've got Grand Rapids and other places. Their ballots have not fully been counted. But we're going now to Wisconsin, where we're joined by John Nichols. He's the Nation magazine's national affairs correspondent and host of the podcast Next Left. His most recent book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. John, talk about what's happening in Wisconsin right now. Before we were speaking, the margin was much tighter. It's increased a bit to 20,000 with Joe Biden ahead. But talk about what's been counted, what hasn't, and what your assessment is of what's happening in Wisconsin.
Well, thanks for having me on, Amy. And what a night it has been. I can tell you that as I look around Wisconsin, and I just got off the phone with some key players around the state and party folks and local officials who all were up through the night, it does look, and again, we'll see what scattering may be out there, it looks like Joe Biden has a sufficient lead to win Wisconsin. I know that 21,000 votes seems like a very small margin, but you should understand that it is almost twice what John Kerry won the state by in 2004, and almost 4 times what Al Gore won the state by in 2000. And so the fact of the matter is, Wisconsin is a battleground state. And when I look around the state right now, it appears that the key places have reported. And what happened tonight was that early on, Trump had a quite substantial lead. And in many ways, the reporting on that went to the heart of the problem with how media covers election night. because it was reporting from more rural areas and from more suburban areas. It takes longer to count a lot of votes in a big city. And so Milwaukee took till around 4 a.m. When Milwaukee came in,
John, we're losing you a little bit. Your Skype is going in and out. So if you could repeat what you just said about Milwaukee.
Sure, I apologize.
We
when
may just
Milwaukee
have to go to audio for you, but go. We're gonna go to break. We're gonna try to fix this, even if we just get you on audio, because this is absolutely critical. What's happening in Wisconsin? John Nichols, the nation's national affairs correspondent, host of the podcast Next Left. We're also talking to Ben Jealous, who's now head of People for the American Way and has a USA Today op-ed and editorial. Election chaos, keep calm, keep counting, and get to work, as well as Brianna Joy Gray, former national press secretary for Bernie Sanders 2020. Stay with us.
I've known lots of sorrow. In my time, I've suffered great pain. My poor heart is often been mended, but only to be broken. Of a love that will last for all time. Yes, and I wonder, as I often wonder, how long will I wander this time? As I pause to recall a few good times, my memory grows hazy and dim.
That's Nina Simone, How Long Must I Wonder? This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we talk about this day after Election Day, the day that so many around the country have warned, especially secretaries of state, we will not necessarily know who won the race for president. Not to mention many senatorial races, congressional races, that the ballots must be counted. The ballots that were cast on Election Day and the ones that were cast early. I mean, there was a record-shattering number, 101, more than 101 million people cast votes early in this 2020 election, either an absentee ballot or early in-person voting. And all those votes must count. Many races are still in contention. Some have been called. Our guests are Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way, former head of the NAACP, and formerly ran for governor of Maryland. We're also joined by Brianna Joy Gray, former national press secretary for Bernie Sanders 2020. John Nichols is the nation's national affairs correspondent and host of the podcast Next Left. His most recent book is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. Brianna Joy Gray, if you can talk about, I asked Ben about this earlier, but about the kind of organizing that's going on right now, with you have President Trump announcing he's won and that these elections are fraudulent if The states do not announce for him. He wants every vote counted in Arizona, where Fox and other news outlets, including AP, have called it for Joe Biden. But in Pennsylvania, he wants these absentee ballots, the voting count, to stop. Talk about the organizing before the election to get people to vote, and what's happening now, and what you want, how you want to see the Democratic Party respond.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think the real story here is the extent to which certain really key demographics who truly comprise the Democratic Party base were completely either ignored or undervalued, or those votes were assumed and not actually earned, right? So there was a lot of talk about the importance of Black and Latino voters during the primary that very quickly dissipated in the general when it became assumed that because Donald Trump is a racist who has backed a number of policies that disproportionately heap harm on those groups, that those votes would automatically come over to Joe Biden. But as you pointed out earlier, people can and do stay home. So in fact, exit polls show that Donald Trump did better with every demographic group except for white men. He's down 5 with white men, up 2 with white women, up 4 with both Black men and Black women, and up 3 with both Latino men and Latinas. And that's something that people are going to have to deal with. Now, my former colleague, Kayla Lacey at The Intercept, came out with a video earlier this week in which she interviewed and profiled voters in Philadelphia, and these were predominantly Black voters. Several of the men that were spoken to said, no, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden because it was his policies from the 1990s that resulted in so many of my friends and families wasting their lives in jail, and they can't get that time back. There were other Black voters that she spoke to who sighed in a kind of resigned fashion to say, yes, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, but I'm not enthusiastic about it. So again, the crime here is that the vote is this close. And while we, Democrats are looking hopefully to the returns from these major urban areas that are Blacker and supposedly more Democrat than the rest of the state, it remains to be seen whether or not Joe Biden did enough to demonstrate that that Black voters faithfully voting for Democrats in 90+% numbers for the last 50 years has resulted in a sufficient return on that investment that they're going to do so again this time around.
I want to go to John Nichols in Madison, Wisconsin. John, I think we'll be able to hear you better on the telephone. So if you can explain what's happening in Milwaukee, what's happening in Green Bay, where President Trump spent a lot of time, and the votes at this point about 20,000 apart. It's a very close race, but Joe Biden does seem to be ahead.
Looks like a very, very narrow margin, but it's important to understand that Donald Trump only won the state by around 22,000 votes 4 years ago. And of the last 6 elections in Wisconsin, 4 of them have been decided or look to have been decided by under 25,000 votes. So this is what happens in Wisconsin. And the fact of the matter is a lot of our media covered Wisconsin last night terribly because they were looking at those early results and really underestimating what was still out and where it was still out. You have to wait for the ballots to be counted. When the ballots were counted in Milwaukee, and that count finished around 4 a.m., they brought in a better part of 150,000 additional votes for Joe Biden. That closed the gap dramatically, and then that actually put Biden a little bit ahead. When Green Bay came in closer to 5 a.m., that put Biden up by roughly 11,000 votes. And amazingly enough, Kenosha, the city of Kenosha, where Donald Trump did his last campaign stop on the eve of the election, clearly intending to exploit the story of what had happened in Kenosha in August with the shooting 7 times in the back by a police officer of Jacob Blake, and then a few days later, the shooting of 2 protesters by an armed white vigilante on the streets. Trump was trying to exploit that, but in the end, Kenosha produced another almost 10,000 votes for Joe Biden. What we're looking at right now is a circumstance where Biden has a lead. The vote appears to be overwhelmingly in. It doesn't look like there's anything substantial out. And Wisconsin has never had a recount where you overturned 20,000 votes. That's never happened. And so when I spoke this morning to the chairman of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, Ben Wickler, he was feeling actually very confident. And if I can add one final thing here, coming off what my friends have just said moments ago, this gets to the heart of the matter. At about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, folks and activists got the word that their Milwaukee vote was not sufficient, or it didn't look that the turnout was sufficient, and a massive final push was put on in the last 4 hours using social media and everything they had. All this focus went on Milwaukee, and the truth of the matter is that they very possibly, activists and some Democratic Party folks, really put Biden over the top in literally the last hours.
So I want to say that as we're broadcasting this, in Michigan, 64% of the vote has been counted in Wayne County, which includes, it's the largest county in Michigan and includes Detroit. It's a very close race there, gone down from President Trump being hundreds of thousands of votes ahead to now thousands of votes ahead. He has 49.4% of the vote to Biden's 48.9. Georgia, 8% of the vote remains to be counted overall in Michigan. 14% of the vote remains to be counted. In Pennsylvania, 25%, a quarter of the vote remains to be counted. Brianna, I wanted to ask you about media coverage of how serious of what they value and what they don't, especially in the corporate media, raising issues of concern like the Latinx population and the African-American population not responding as much to Biden's message.
Yeah, well, the corporate media lied to Americans about what electability entailed. And principally, they did that in the primary by pretending as though the 13% of voters in South Carolina that participated in the primary were a good bellwether for how various groups of people of color across the country would vote, particularly in those states that are actually game changers in an election, unlike South Carolina. So the fact that Bernie Sanders was consistently winning 70% of the Latino vote was erased, and the Bernie bro mythology persisted from the beginning. In Iowa, it has a small non-white population. It's 10%, but Bernie Sanders dominated there because the campaign invested early and thought it was important to station campaign workers outside of meatpacking plants who spoke Amharic, who could communicate to the various communities that were living there. Despite all of the coverage and back and forth about the culinary workers and the so-called abuse that they were receiving from Bernie supporters, they broke with leadership, and those predominantly Latino workers supported Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly, and he won 70% of the vote in Nevada. And when that happened, you had media figures like Soledad O'Brien saying, well, I'll wait and see what happens when non-white states vote, right? When diverse states vote, completely erasing any voters of color that weren't black. And now we're seeing what's happening. One other aspect of this was the narrative about Florida and how Bernie Sanders couldn't possibly win there because of the socialism smear and how that was going to affect more conservative Latino communities. Well, look what's happened. That smear was still applied and appears to have stuck to some degree to Joe Biden. But what you don't have is the positive ability to run on incredibly popular programs like Medicare for All and student debt cancellation and a more progressive immigration platform than Joe Biden had. And so it looks as though Joe Biden's strategy to get this, defector Republican did not work. There weren't enough of these moderate Republicans to go after. And who knows how many genuine progressives or working class people who simply needed material uplift that could have been delivered by these progressive policies. Who knows how many of them could have come over to our side. And one last point, if you look at the fact that Florida passed a $15 minimum wage raise, but didn't vote for Joe Biden. You see there the gap between the politician and the policy and what might have been able to be achieved if Joe Biden had, in fact, allowed himself to be pushed left in a way that he wasn't. Even in the midst of the biggest protest in American history, he didn't budge. So the work of activists is really made for them.
I want to read a statement from Biden campaign manager Jen O'Malley Dillon, who said the president's statement tonight about trying to shut down the counting of duly cast ballots was outrageous, unprecedented, and incorrect. Having encouraged Republican efforts in multiple states to prevent the legal counting of these ballots before Election Day, now Donald Trump is saying these ballots can't be counted after Election Day either. That's a statement from Biden campaign manager Jen O'Malley Dillon. Ben Jealous, finally, where you see what's happening going today. Again, the headline of your op-ed in USA Today, election chaos, keep calm, keep counting, get to work. And you know what happened in 2000. You know when the recounting was happening in the Bush v. Gore presidential race in Florida. A group of Republican operatives posing as grassroots activists, but many of them coming from Washington, stormed the area where the recount was happening and stopped it. And that ultimately threw it into the Supreme Court, which made the decision. And we know that certainly Donald Trump knows that route and said very ominously last night, I will take this to the Supreme Court. Not saying he was going to take it up to the Supreme Court, but right to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, look, what we're in the midst of right now is an epic battle between money and people. In our country, those are the two forces. You have folks who organize money and folks who organize people. Donald Trump has installed a far right-wing justice, his 6-1, pushed by organized money that is very keen on destroying the Affordable Care Act. On the other hand, Joe Biden has organized the American people. He has won the national popular vote. I think he's up more than 2 million at this point. And we've just got to keep calm because it looks like not only has he won the national popular vote, but he will win the electoral college vote too. What every American should be doing right now who's outraged by the president's attempt to steal this election and the special interests who are pushing him to do that and push through Amy Coney Barrett is to make sure that you're organized. The people can beat money every day, but you have to be organized. There will be protests across this country today in response to the president's outrageous comments last night. If you feel safe being at them, you should be at them. You should sign up with groups, whether it's People For or it's Move On or it's the NAACP or Color of Change. We've got to be organized in this moment. And then once we win, and I do believe we will win, we have to make sure that the national popular vote counts. We have to end this crazy sort of gerrymandering of presidential politics where entire demographics are treated like they don't count. Entire states are treated like they don't count. And the American people, frankly, eyes glaze over when they see, and their faith starts to wane when they see the popular vote not matter presidential after presidential after presidential after presidential. So I would just say kind of 1, 2, 3. We did step 1, we turned out to vote. Step 2, make sure every vote is counted. And step 3, make sure that every vote matters.
Ben Jealous, we want to thank you for being with us. President of People for the American Way, Brianna Joy Gray, former press secretary for Bernie Sanders, co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, and John Nichols of The Nation magazine, speaking to us from Wisconsin. That does it for our show. An enormous thank you to our entire team, produced by Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Trina Nadura, Sam Alcoff. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley, Paul Powell. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.